Hello and good morning. Welcome. Thank you all for being willing to spend your mornings with us. Today we are hosting our fall webinar. So welcome to the University of Miami's Miller School of Medicine Comprehensive Center for Brain Health fall webinar. Today we're going to be discussing hot topics in brain health. Before we get started, I want to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Amy Rosenfeld. I'm a physical therapist and the Assistant Director for Education. I also head up the GATE Lab here at the Comprehensive Center for Brain Health in our Boca Raton facility. Before we get started, let's go ahead and review the schedule of events. I'm going to share this schedule right here. So starting in just a few minutes, we're going to be discussing with Dr. James Galvin, Building a Better Brain, followed by Dr. Michael Kleinman. He's going to be discussing using speech to understand the aging brain, followed by Carrie Greenfield. She's our nurse practitioner, our health coach. She's going to discuss integrative nutrition and brain health. Once her discussion is concluded, I'm going to lead you all in a very short stretch. We'll take a break, and then we'll go into the live Q&A. So that you know, if throughout this webinar, you can submit your questions in the Q&A portion of this Zoom. That is one way that you can communicate with us. And another way is through our, we have this, a QR code that I will be flashing on the screen, and you can scan it. I'll be flashing it several times throughout the talk. It is a way to fill out a survey about your participation in research, and somebody from our facility will be getting back with you once you complete that survey. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. James Galvin's talk. And as you see here, we have Dr. Michael Kleinman, we have Carrie Greenfield here, and Dr. James Galvin. Let's all give a wave, hello. And so we have Dr. Galvin. He's a professor of neurology, psychiatry, and behavioral sciences at the University of Miami's Miller School of Medicine. He's also the founding director of the Comprehensive Center for Brain Health. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and we'll get started with the discussion. Thanks everybody for being here.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. James Galvin, and I'd like to welcome you to our fall conference. Unfortunately, we still have to do it by Zoom, but we're very hopeful that come the spring, we'll be able to meet in person. As Dr. Rosenfeld introduced, we'll have a number of topics today. I'm going to talk about building a better brain, which is going to cover some of our research and really talk about the opening of our research center, which we're very excited about. As we get started, I just want to first acknowledge the wonderful, amazing team I get to work with every day. Their names are listed on the side here. And additionally, just as a shout out to our multiple grants which support our research efforts, both from the National Institutes of Health as well as private donors. I'd also like to give a shout out to all of our collaborators, both at the University of Miami and around the world and country, who help us do all of our research. So we're really thankful to them. So to kick this off, I'd like to talk a little bit about the concept of dementia prevention. Now, some of you may have heard me talk about this before, but I think it's worth bringing it up again just to drive home the point. This is something I've been interested in for a number of years. Instead of waiting for people to have disease and then trying to treat their disease, why not try to think about what we could do to prevent disease from ever starting? So this is a paper we published a couple of years ago, and on the y-axis is people's thinking ability, their cognitive functioning, and on the x-axis is age. So from birth until like the mid 40s or early 50s or so, this is the concept of primary prevention. People have no complaints and their brain shows no signs of diseases like Alzheimer's disease. The idea here is you want to try to prevent the onset of disease before there's any evidence of injury. So these are people with no cognitive impairment or people who have subjective cognitive impairment. They have complaints about their memory. From mid 40s to the mid 60s, this is the concept of secondary prevention. So some changes in the brain have already begun. Things like amyloid can deposit in the brain, but people don't have any symptoms yet. This is a concept of preclinical disease. No symptoms, but changes in the brain. Here, we want to try to reduce the impact of disease that's already started. We want to reduce the prevalence, the appearance of the symptoms. And this would be people who are either in preclinical Alzheimer's disease or people with the mildest, earliest signs of objective issues, such as mild cognitive impairment. And then from the mid 60s on, we're in the concept of tertiary prevention, right? The disease has already started. There's already symptoms. What we want to do is try to limit the disability and negative consequences of the disease. And so these are people with mild cognitive impairment and people with Alzheimer's and related disorders. This is a study we published several years ago. And these were people who came every year for annual assessments, much like we do here at the Comprehensive Center for Brain Health. In the dark line are people who came into the project as healthy controls and stayed as healthy controls the entire time they were in the project. And people in the dotted lines are people who came as healthy controls, but later developed Alzheimer's disease, right where this dotted line occurs. And what we found was people who are healthy controls showed very little change over years. So here's 10 years of being followed, almost no change in their memory and thinking functions. And the people who would eventually develop Alzheimer's disease, initially, they look just like the controls. But about 2 years before they are diagnosed, we see the beginnings of a change in their cognition, an inflection point. And after this, their cognition continues to get worse. Between the time of the diagnosis and this inflection point represents this preclinical period. So if we go back to my model that I showed you before, from birth up until this preclinical period, this is how we do primary prevention. Between the inflection point and the diagnosis, we can do secondary prevention. And after the diagnosis, we can do tertiary prevention. Different strategies, but they all approach the idea of how can we limit the effects of Alzheimer's and related disorders on brain health and functioning. So when someone comes to see me, I'm a neurologist, when someone comes to see me and I diagnose them with Alzheimer's disease or some related disorder, that's when they first show up. But before they came to the office, they might be noticing cognitive symptoms. So they have cognitive decline. And this might begin 1 to 2 years before their diagnosis. Before they have cognitive decline, they have injury to their brain, neuron injury or brain cell injury and brain cell death. Okay, and this may begin 3 to 5 years before their symptoms are diagnosed. Before that, they have deposits of amyloid and tangles inside their brain, the plaques and tangles of Alzheimer's disease, for example. And that may begin 10 to 20 years before they're diagnosed. So a very long window for which we might be able to do something. But before there are plaques and tangles depositing in the brain, there are things that increase the risk of this happening. So let's call that risk factor A, okay? But when we study people at autopsy, and when we do MRIs and PET scans and other types of tests, well, we find that the people just don't have plaques and tangles. They have lots of other things happening. They have small vascular lesions, they have inflammation, they have oxidative stress. So these other pathologies also contribute to neuronal injury, cognitive decline, and the clinical presentation. But since they're different than plaques and tangles, they must by definition have different risk factors. So let's call that risk factor B. So if we wanted to develop a program that could prevent or treat or reduce Alzheimer's disease, we could either address the plaques and tangles, and this is what pharmaceutical companies are doing, Or we could think about addressing all of these other pathologies, which is the focus of our work. So the concept is, can we build a better brain as we get older? So this is a cartoon that was published 2 years ago in The Lancet. And I really like the cartoon. It really kind of tells the story that I want to tell you. So when we think about eventually developing Alzheimer's disease, about 60% of the risk is unknown, something we can't control. We don't have any really great way of either explaining it or changing it. But from early life, there are things that happen that increase the risk of developing disease. So in early life, your education, your cognitive reserve come into play. By midlife, brain injury, high blood pressure, alcohol use, obesity, hearing loss. In later life, smoking, depression, diabetes, physical inactivity. All of these things together explain about 40% of the risk of Alzheimer's disease. And what's important is that they're modifiable. There are things that we can do about it. So when I think about this in the big picture, there are things we can control, that's about 40%. There are things we can't control, that's about 60%, like age, sex, family history, genetics. I don't worry about the things I can't control, but let's focus on the things that I can control and see if I can make a real difference in a person's life. So that tells me then it's never too late, it's never too early. But if I had a choice, it's better to be too early than it is to be too late. Let me just give you an example. So if we think about the risk factors for developing a disease like Alzheimer's disease, smoking increased the risk of Alzheimer's disease by about 60%, 60%. That means that about 4.7 million cases of Alzheimer's disease can be directly attributable to smoking worldwide, okay? And if we were able to just have a 25% reduction in smoking, we could prevent up to 1 million cases around the world. I could show you the same type of numbers for obesity, for inactivity, for education, for diabetes, depression, hypertension, a whole host of other factors. And if you think about each of these individually, they would all contribute to significantly reducing the number of people who develop disease. But what if we thought about them all together and really thought about a way that we could build a better brain as we get older? This gets to this concept of what we call resilience and vulnerability. So we know from rare familial forms of Alzheimer's disease, about 2% of cases, that there are some genes that cause disease. And we've learned a lot about the disease by studying these genes. But it's much more difficult to explain the more common forms of Alzheimer's disease, which are sporadic, which means they're not genetic. I often wonder, and I'm sure you do too, why do some people develop Alzheimer's disease and some people don't? Why are some people more resilient or resistant to developing disease, and some people more vulnerable or more likely to develop disease? The fact is, there's no single risk factor that can explain resilience or vulnerability. It's likely a very complex interaction between genetics, exposures, and lifestyles. But we need to be able to figure out a way of studying this, because we think that good resilience can protect against a bad environment, and that bad vulnerability factors might be buffered by a good environment. So if we can figure out the things we can modify, we can make a significant difference in reducing the overall risk of developing a disease like Alzheimer's disease. The challenge becomes, how do we measure these things? How do we measure resilience? How do we measure vulnerability? Who do we ask the questions to? So the things that increase resilience are things like education or cognitive reserve, physical activity, cognitive activity, being mindful, being socially active, eating a healthy diet. There are things that increase the risk, vulnerability, like comorbid diseases, diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, vascular risk factors, frailty, physical impairment, obesity. We can think about all these things individually, but how do we measure them? How do we determine who's at risk for getting disease and who's not? So we spent the better part of the last 2 years trying to solve this problem. we created a resilience index. This is a measure that allows us to capture how healthy a brain is. And it's composed of 6 factors. Cognitive reserve, right? That is your brain's ability to resist amyloid plaques and tangles and vascular lesions and inflammation. Social engagement, how socially active you are. Your physical activity, your cognitive activity, your mindfulness. Do you live in the moment or do you let the weight of the world bear down on you? And your diet, what you're eating. You're going to hear a talk about diet in a little bit. And combining these all together, we can actually get a score that tells us about someone's brain health. It's called resilience. And what we know is that people who are healthy controls have much higher resilience than people who have MCI, mild cognitive impairment. And people with MCI have much higher resilience than people who have Alzheimer's disease or related disorders. Also, within each group, people who are controls who have high resilience have better performance than people who have low resilience. Within mild cognitive impairment, people who have high resilience have better performance than people who have low resilience. And within the ADRD group, people who have high resilience have better performance than people who have low resilience. And that's very important. That means that we can make significant changes in our overall risk of disease and progression of symptoms by addressing these factors. We now can also measure vulnerability. We've created something called a vulnerability index. So this is a weighted scale, which means that different factors have different values associated with them based on things that are not modifiable, like age and sex, and things that are modifiable, like diabetes and frailty and heart disease and obesity. And what's nice about this scale is, unlike the resilience scale where people have to fill out questionnaires, the vulnerability index includes things that we can extract from people's medical records, right? So we can get a really good sense of how unhealthy a person's brain is, okay? And what we found, again, is that people who are healthy controls have lower vulnerability than people who have mild cognitive impairment. And people with mild cognitive impairment have lower vulnerability than people who have dementia. And within groups, people controls with low vulnerability have better functional and cognitive performance than people with high vulnerability. And with MCI, people with low vulnerability have better function and cognitive performance than people who have high vulnerability. Once you have dementia, vulnerability doesn't really separate out people, right? So we can't use vulnerability to make diagnoses or classify people. We can get a sense of how healthy or unhealthy a brain is. So this allows us to have sort of a conceptual model, how we visualize how all these things come together. So we have resilience factors. We have things that occur in early life, your cognitive reserve, your education, your occupation, things like that. And things in mid to late life, your cognitive activity, your physical activity, your social engagement, diet, and mindfulness. And all of these things contribute to your brain's resilience. Your brain resilience contributes to your brain health in a positive way. Then there are other things that contribute to your brain health in a negative way. And that includes your vulnerability and what we call social determinants of health. So these are things that we can't necessarily change, but impact our health, right? So things that are hard to research, but are important. So income, your housing, available transportation, your access to care, your access to food, right? And so these things can negatively impact your brain health. And your brain health is going to determine whether you're cognitively normal, have mild cognitive impairment, or whether you have dementia. We can now start to build models that tell us about the risk of individuals. So when someone first walks through the door, we have an assessment that allows us to collect resilience, that's a measure of brain health, vulnerability, a measure of brain disease, and a test we developed called the number symbol coding test, which is a measure of brain performance. And if we plot it X, Y, and Z, so a three-dimensional plot, what we can see is we start to see groups of people, right? So the red dots are healthy controls. So let's just focus on the red dots for a second. This red dot, this healthy control, excuse me, has low vulnerability, high resilience, and high cognitive performance. They're not only a control, but they're likely to stay a control for the rest of their lives. Let's look at this red dot right here. It's sitting in a sea of green and blue. Green are people who have dementia. Blue are people who have mild cognitive impairment. Okay, so even though this person's a control, they have high vulnerability, low resilience, and low performance on a test. This person is at a very high risk of developing Alzheimer's disease in the near future. So we can be very aggressive in terms of the prevention measures that we can initiate to try to change the overall risk. Likewise, for the blue dots, people with mild cognitive impairment, some people go on to develop Alzheimer's and other people don't. Here's a blue dot that looks a lot like the controls. So even though there's some mild changes, this person's much less likely to progress, or if they do progress, it's going to be very slow. Whereas this person, blue dot, is in the middle of all these green dots. This is a person who's likely to progress to Alzheimer's disease pretty soon. So again, we can sort of personalize or tailor the interventions that we offer people. What's nice about this is that we can start to discriminate groups. So we can look about how people show up in the office and just based on these brief assessments, determine whether they're likely to be impaired or not impaired. And if they're impaired, we can determine whether they have MCI or dementia. And that's powerful, right? Because we don't need potentially, a 5-hour assessment to do this. We can do it very briefly. And this is a major focus of our research. Can we translate this so this could be done in general practice for providers all over the world to do this same type of assessment? What's even more interesting is we can start to discriminate what kind of dementia people may have, right? So using the same type of X, Y, and Z plot, now instead of showing all the dementia groups together, we start to separate them out. So our healthy controls in black are different than our mild cognitive impairments in red, and they're different than the dementia group. And so we have the orange, which is Lewy body dementia, the green, which is Alzheimer's dementia, and the purple, which is vascular dementia. And these three disorders share a lot of common risk factors. So in fact, they cluster together. But frontal temporal degeneration, which is a very, very different type of disease, is different. It shares different risk factors. So we're able to look at this and potentially determine what's the cause of the memory impairment, and we can design very specific therapies for that individual. So we've been able to put this all together, develop what we call a brain health platform. So we have a test called the Healthy Brain 9, which is a measure of subjective cognitive performance. In other words, it's filled out by an individual to let us know how they're functioning on an everyday basis. We have the number symbol coding test, which is a brief measure of cognitive performance. So we have objective measurements of how someone does on a test. We have the resilience index, which looks at brain health, and the vulnerability index, which looks at brain disease. And these 4 components can be completed in about 15 to 30 minutes, right? If you're cognitively normal, about 15. If you have MCI or mild dementia, about 30 minutes, okay? We're developing this as an online platform so that people can do this right in the privacy of their own home, complete this assessment. And we can use this to recruit people for clinical research projects, enroll them in clinical trials or other studies, and eventually apply it in clinical care. And we're validating this across multiple populations, right? We are looking at how this does in African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans, in Hispanics and American Indians, and out in Hawaii, and we're now starting a study out in American Samoa. So I want to talk a little bit about our key project, which is called the Healthy Brain Initiative, okay? So everything I showed you up to this part is kind of leading into how we're applying this going forward at the Comprehensive Center for Brain Health. The Healthy Brain Initiative, or HBI, is now beginning to recruit individuals. We're looking for people who live out in the community. They're relatively independent. They have no complaints or mild concerns about their brain health. We want to develop a way of preventing dementia using a precision medicine-like approach. right? So that we can develop personalized interventions in people that are really well characterized. This initiative is funded by multiple grants that I showed you at the beginning of this presentation. Now, one of the requirements is you have to have a study partner. That's a person who knows you well and can answer questions about your cognitive abilities. So a spouse, a partner, child, a best friend. The study partner can come with you to the visit, or they can do this all by phone or by Zoom, okay? To participate, you have to be willing to have a blood draw and undergo testing and some imaging studies, an MRI and or PET scan, okay? And we're looking to recruit up to 5,000 people. So we're looking for people over the age of 25, although our target population is 50 to 85. That's the group we want to have the largest number of individuals, but we'll have people on either side of that as well. So we're looking for people that have no cognitive impairment, people who have subjective cognitive impairment, that is, you're a little concerned about your memory, or people who have mild cognitive impairment, so still doing everything independent, but clearly there's some objective changes in your memory, or any cause of dementia at the mild stage, okay? Again, you have to have a study partner and you have to be willing to do all the testing. The exclusion criteria, who's not eligible for the study, are people who don't consent to allow us to store their data and their specimens. If a person already has moderate to severe dementia, they're not eligible for HBI. We may have other projects that people are eligible for, okay? But for this particular project, we're really looking at people with mild dementia or less, okay? If there's a significant illness that could interfere with participation, like unstable diabetes or cancer or substance abuse, then you can't participate in this project, although there may be other projects for you, okay? And if you're of childbearing age, we have to make sure that you're not pregnant before you do like a PET scan, right? So if you are pregnant, you could still participate, but you can't do the PET scan. So we just need to make sure for safety purposes. Why we're so excited is after a very long delay, largely due to a global pandemic, which interfered with a lot of people's lives, we're finally opening up our new comprehensive center for brain health at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. This is a newly renovated center, 13,000 square feet, okay, large center. And we're located in Boca Raton. We're located at 7700 West Camino Real, Suite 200. So we have the entire second floor of the building. So this is on the intersection of Powerline and Camino Real. And this center houses all of our research, clinical, and educational programs. We have ample parking, including handicap spaces. It's free parking. It's very convenient to 95, the Turnpike, and the Sawgrass, because it's located right off Powerline and Camino Real. And it's close to shops and restaurants, so there's places to go get to eat. So this is a picture of the outside of the building. If you've driven down Powerline, in front of us over here, there's a Citibank and a SunTrust Bank. So we're right in back of that on the second floor. This is our lobby, which is really nice. Yep, we're 13,000 square feet. So lots of rooms available for doing all the amazing things that we're capable of doing at our center. We're just moving in. Our furniture came last week. So here's some shots of our nice spacious office space, our conference rooms, our waiting room. So we're really excited about this. Our website is now live. I'll give you the web address in a second. So you can learn so much more about what we do, and you can scroll through learning all about us, about our research, about the different services we offer, how to participate in research, and if you want to support us in any way, there are options to do that as well. We're now opening up our social media sites. We now have a Facebook page and a Twitter account. Hope to be opening Instagram and a YouTube channel in the near future. Our social media address is @UMiamiCCBH. So please consider following us on our Twitter account so that we can give you our tweets as we discuss all our advances in our research and clinical care. So to summarize, up to 40% of the attributable risk for Alzheimer's disease and related disorders is modifiable. We really need to rethink how we diagnose and treat these diseases. Resilience and vulnerability provide powerful tools to study brain health and the risk of disease. Dementia prevention may be possible using a precision medicine-like approach, and this is the goal of our research. What we've learned is there may be multiple pathways to developing disease. Thus, there may be also multiple paths to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent these diseases. Our new center is opening. We will soon be able to offer all of our research, clinical, and education programs. If you like what you hear, contact us. Tell other people, have them contact us. Remember, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That was Benjamin Franklin in 1735. And this is how you can contact us. I'll leave this up for a couple minutes. And we'll put this up again later during the presentation. Our address is 7700 West Camino Real, Suite 200 in Boca Raton. Our phone number is 561-869-6808. You can email us at healthybrain@miami.edu. Our website is umiamibrainhealth.org. Our Facebook and Twitter accounts are @umiamiccbh. Thank you so much for attending our seminar. I look forward to addressing your questions during our question and answer session. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you all for attending the fall webinar of the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine, Comprehensive Center for Brain Health. I'm Dr. Michael J. Kleiman, a postdoctoral research fellow here at the CCBH. Today, I'd like to discuss a fairly esoteric field of study, but one that's gaining a lot of traction lately. That would be the application of speech analysis to measure cognitive functioning in both healthy aging and in dementia. Let's start off by talking about healthy brain aging. As we age, very mild cognitive decline occurs, and is most noticeable past the age of 65 or 70. This can manifest as forgetting someone's name, misplacing objects, or difficulty remembering the right word in a sentence. For the most part, this is normal. As we age, the part of our brain called white matter degrades gradually. You might be familiar with the term. Our brains are made up of both white matter and gray matter. Gray matter, which is actually pinkish gray, are the actual brain cells themselves, while the white matter, which looks like a whiter shade of pink, acts like a network in the middle of the brain to connect the neurons to each other. This white matter is actually made up of something called myelin, which coats the long neurons in a similar way to how a wire is coated on the outside with rubber. This coating causes the electrical signals in the neuron to travel a lot faster than if it were uncoated. You can see that the neuron on the right, which is coated with myelin, has a much faster electrical signal than the uncoated neuron on the left. As the myelin degrades due to aging, signals get slightly slower, making it more difficult to perform cognitive tasks that require a large degree of interconnectivity between regions in the brain. One of those tasks is speaking. The act of speaking is neurologically very complex. When you're preparing to speak, you first think of the idea of what to say. Then you think of the words, which then travels to the part of the brain in charge of actually producing the sounds of the speech. The reverse happens when you listen. You process the sounds, which get further processed as words, and then the idea behind the words. As we age, these connections slow down, leading to things like slower speech, less diversity in the types of words we use, and the use of simpler phrasing and colloquialisms. I like to think of this reversion to simpler and less diverse phrasing as a case of a very large library. Say that there's a library with a large number of bookcases. The more general books are in the front, and the highly specialized books on particular topics are in the back. When we're young, it's easy for us to run quickly to wherever we need to, whether that's a particular spot in the front or all the way in the back. As we grow older, we walk a bit slower, So instead of choosing to walk towards the back of the library to retrieve a specific book, we instead opt to walk maybe halfway to get a book that fits the purpose, but maybe isn't the absolute best choice. This doesn't mean that it's impossible for us to get to the back of the library, but if we don't need to, say if there's an acceptable but not perfect match, we opt to save the energy instead. Choosing words or phrases is similar. As we age, the white matter coding begins to break down just a little bit. That causes connections within the brain to also slow down. If it takes too long to think of the best word choice, we often fall back on more common, easily accessible words or phrases that may not be the best choice, but are close enough. Pathological or disease-driven decline is a bit different. Depending on the type of disorder, there's often a much more pronounced decline in speech, because instead of the connections simply being slightly slower as in normal aging, suddenly individual neurons or even whole networks are stopped altogether. In Alzheimer's disease and Lewy body dementia, the degradation is fairly widespread, leading to more hesitations and pausing and less organized speech overall. But speech doesn't completely shut down until much later stages, where the degradation is more severe. In vascular dementia or stroke, damage can often be a lot more localized, sometimes directly in speech-related areas, which can affect speech patterns, speech production, as well as aphasia entirely. If you take a look at the differences side by side, it's easy to see what's normal and what's not. In healthy decline, you have a slightly slower rate of speech that's a bit more subtle, whereas in pathological decline caused by Alzheimer's, that rate of speech is greatly slowed and is actually very noticeable. In healthy decline, you trend towards using a bit less complex words, whereas in pathological decline, the majority of the words that are used are simple. In healthy decline, you might occasionally lose track of what you're saying, but in pathological decline, you could frequently restate phrases, sometimes multiple times within a few minutes. In healthy decline, you might infrequently stutter and stumble over a word or two, but in pathological decline, you might even have trouble saying words entirely. But these changes don't only occur in later stages of dementia. Because dementia is progressive over the course of years before it is often diagnosed, these changes in speech behavior often start to occur before other types of cognitive changes become obvious. It's important to keep in mind that not everyone who has a biomarker of Alzheimer's will actually go on to develop Alzheimer's disease. So being able to predict who will become impaired is critical to testing new drugs and therapies. In studies that follow cognitively normal participants with some evidence of dementia biomarkers over many, many years, those who eventually go on to develop dementia are found to have reduced diversity in their word choices. Pauses and hesitations like and normally increase with age. However, some studies suggest that the rate and length of those pauses increase in very early Alzheimer's compared to healthy controls. If you're trying to detect early impairment, though, it's critical that you choose the right type and category of speech assessment for the job. There are two categories of assessment based on the two types of speech: connected speech and unconnected speech. Connected speech is basically just natural discourse. Each word choice is connected to each other word in a continuous phrase. This contrasts with unconnected speech. In these types of tasks, participants are asked to retrieve separate words that may be semantically related to each other, as in naming as many vegetables as you can think of, but aren't connected in a full sentence or phrase. Each is affected by both age-related and pathological decline. However, unconnected speech is more easily and widely researched, and that makes sense. It's a lot easier to count the number of words that a participant can think of than it is to calculate how diverse one's vocabulary is within a phrase. But the benefit of connected speech is that it is more sensitive to subtle or widespread neural impact, as there are far more neural pathways involved in describing a picture than there are in remembering a series of words. This means that connected speech is able to detect much more mild impairment and can even be used to assess decline in normal aging, whereas unconnected speech tasks are a bit less effective. Unconnected speech tasks are fairly easy both to take and to analyze, as they only involve single word production. The semantic and verbal fluency tasks require participants to remember as many words as they can from either a semantic category, like tools or vegetables, or a letter-based category, like all words that begin with the letter A. These tasks measure word recall from long-term memory, as well as speech production, and are included in many neuropsychological batteries. The object naming task is another unconnected speech task that involves simply saying what an object or picture is. This task is usually not impaired until later stages of dementia, because it involves fairly robust, high connectivity pathways of language production that typically aren't affected until most of these pathways begin to deteriorate. As a result, it isn't very useful for measuring normal age-related decline or very mild impairment. In connected speech tasks, we encourage participants to engage in natural speech production by asking open-ended questions like describe your typical Sunday, or by eliciting complex descriptions or explanations of a picture or scene. The connected speech task with the simplest administration is the spontaneous speech task. Essentially, you just need to answer an open-ended question, like what do you do on a typical Sunday, or how do you get yourself ready in the morning? Even though everyone will give completely different answers, you can still calculate things like rate of speech, diversity of word choices, frequency of pronoun versus noun versus verb usage, rate and length of hesitations, and so on. It can be problematic, however, if you don't have a typical schedule on Sundays, or if you do very few things in the morning. To mitigate this, it can be useful to instead have a more guided prompt, while still capturing natural production of speech. A picture description task is a great way to promote natural discourse while ensuring that the subject matter is relatively uniform between participants. To start, a participant will be given the prompt, tell me everything you can see happening in this picture, with very little additional guidance. From their description, we can gather similar metrics as the spontaneous speech task, with the addition of being able to measure what percentage of the picture they described, as well as whether they are correctly interpreting everything that's happening. For example, in this picture, you can see a boy standing on top of a stool, trying to grab cookies from a cookie jar. A girl is reaching out to try and grab a cookie. The mother is washing dishes, but she's not really paying attention and she's letting the sink overflow. Someone that's healthy will easily be able to name everything in the picture, whereas someone that's impaired might not say everything in the picture. They might misinterpret things happening, or they could say the same thing multiple times. Once we have audio recordings and transcripts from each of these tasks, we can then dive into the small details hidden inside them. There are over 100 different individual measurements that we can take from speech. Some of them give us a big picture, while others allow us to measure very small changes in particular types of cognitive functioning over time. Some of these are related, like hesitation length and rate of speech. However, most of these elicit different types of cognition that each require different neural pathways. After collecting all of this data, we can use it to not only measure a single person's cognitive functioning, but paint a broad picture of what both healthy aging and dementia looks like across different groups, races, and ethnicities. A large portion of my research examines each of those individual speech measurements and looks at how each of them decline over time in both healthy older adults and in people with some cognitive impairment. I can look at brain imaging to identify which regions are associated with degradation in certain types of speech. I can also look at how each of these may or may not degrade in relation to other data points, like lifestyle choices, physical health, amount of mentally stimulating leisure activities, socioeconomic status, race, and ethnicity. By researching these associations, we become better able to understand how and why speech and language are differently affected in varying groups of people. allowing us to potentially identify dementia earlier, or even develop strategies to help us maintain our brain health throughout our lifespans. Soon, we'll even be able to test you from the comfort of your own home, just like how you're watching this webinar right now. Thank you so much for your attention. If you have any questions for me or the other speakers, please leave them below using the Q&A button. I look forward to addressing your questions shortly.
Good afternoon. I would like to personally welcome all of you here today to today's webinar. My name is Carrie Greenfield, and I am an adult geriatric nurse practitioner at the Comprehensive Center for Brain Health. At our center, I wear a few different hats. As a clinician in clinic, I specialize in managing and treating the symptoms of those that have been diagnosed with neurodegenerative diseases, such as Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease-related dementias. I have a focus on overall brain health, so I see many individuals that do not have disease, but are interested in a prevention plan to be able to prevent brain disease. The other hat that I wear is that of a health and wellness coach. After 20 years of being a nurse, I realized that I had a tremendous need and desire to go back to school to deepen my understanding and further my education in the field of nutrition. After doing so, I was afforded an opportunity to launch and lead CCBH's Integrative Nutrition Health Coaching Program. In the short amount of time that I have with you here today, I would like to share with you a general overview of my approach and share with you how it can positively impact the lives of so many. So what's on today's menu? Well, to be able to do it right, we have to figure out what's gone wrong. Why are so many of us losing the food battle? What exactly is the integrative nutrition approach? What does that look like? And lastly, how can a health coach help us optimize our overall brain health, our health and happiness, so that we can live our best lives? Let me start by saying that nutrition is a very funny kind of science. It's the only field where people can scientifically prove opposing theories and still be right. So in science, we very much stick to the facts. The Earth rotates on an axis around the sun. That's an accepted truth. Despite all of the nutritional research out there, all of the fancy diet books that are constantly being published, sadly, most Americans are increasingly confused about food. It is therefore my great desire and my great passion to be able to demystify nutrition and to simplify nutrition so that we do not continue to lose the food battle. Another obstacle that gets in the way is the conventional and modern nutrition focus. So conventional nutrition focuses on acquiring more self-discipline and more willpower. So we often hear, just go to the gym, just eat less, just skip dessert. Well, I'm here to say, if it was just that easy. Conventional and modern day approaches do not focus on a whole life approach. It doesn't focus on the importance of exploring the connection between food and everything outside of food that nourishes and truly feeds us. So let me ask you, if there's no one way of eating for everyone, then how is it possible that we can optimize our nutrition and overall health through these conventional methods in which they all subscribe to a one-size-fits-all approach? The answer is we can't. I believe in sharing the integrative nutrition approach as a much newer, easier, and more effective way of reaching our health goals. But before we get there, I just want to comment on all of the fad diets that we are constantly hearing about. There are many problems with these fad diets. Many times in clinic, I will see that they cause nutritional deficiencies. They trigger a host of health problems. Emotionally, they trigger the response of stress and much guilt when we all too many times fail because they are simply non-sustainable. Many times we come out looking just like this minion after having tried and tried one of these approaches to better diets. Year after year, Americans realize that these fad diets just don't work. About 90% of dieters regain their weight plus more weight originally lost. Many who have lost their weight and are maintaining their weight have looked past these diets. They've looked past the trends and they've looked inside themselves to find out what works best for their own bodies. The root cause for many of us not eating properly is often a symptom of other deficiencies in our own lives. We often eat to fill the unfulfilled parts of our lives. Surprisingly, very few nutrition experts address the whole person when devising a nutrition plan. The modern day conventional traditional approaches, they miss the root cause of disordered eating. So they're treating the symptom. They're just treating the fat, not the cause. In my integrative nutrition approach, it gets us to uncover the root cause of our eating habits and the root cause of why we are choosing to live our lives the way we are. Once we identify what in our lives is unsatisfactory to us, then and only then can we start to begin our health journey to our best self. We all know people, maybe ourselves, that eat foods just to comfort them. We eat comfort foods because we're lacking other things in our lives. So the integrative nutrition approach is the idea of looking past the plate. We want to look at a person as an integrated system. We want to look at their physical and mental well-being. We want to look at their spiritual being. We want to look at all of the different emotional parts in their life and how satisfied they are in their life. So how do we do that? Well, we have a tool in clinic. This is one of the many tools that I use in session. And this helps us identify what areas in our lives we're satisfied with and what we are not. The middle point right here is the point of dissatisfaction. As we move up, up, up towards the red, this red line here is maximum satisfaction. So my clients will go through each of these different elements, all of these different elements which nourish us outside of food, and they will plot their points, letting me know how satisfied or not they are in these different domains. Secondary foods are the actual foods that we consume. So that takes us to our meals, our breakfast, our lunch, our dinner, our snacks, and our hydration. I truly believe that the future of nutrition is a world where primary and secondary foods are balanced and aligned for us all. So what is an integrative nutrition health coach? Well, first, let me tell you what I'm not when I'm playing health coach and I leave my nurse practitioner hat behind. I am not giving medical diagnoses in this role. I am not prescribing medications, ordering lab tests, or any other follow-up testing. In my role as your health coach, my main goal is to guide my clients in reaching their health and wellness goals. So whether that's better sleep at night, whether it's boosting their energy levels during the day, weight loss, stress management, or any of the other area of elements in which someone feels like they are not fully satisfied. What we do as health coaches is we create a very safe space for our clients to explore both their primary foods and their secondary food choices. This then allows them to make positive lifestyle changes that are everlasting. In order for us to have optimal mental and physical health, we need to be properly fed and nourished from our primary food pyramid. Diet-related disorders such as heart disease, obesity, cancer, diabetes, these are all national epidemics. One of the main reasons is because we are stuffing ourselves with secondary foods, the foods that we're eating, when we are actually starving to better align our primary foods. Do you remember as a child where you would go out to play, you'd be having so much fun that when your mom and dad called you in for dinner, you wouldn't even realize that you were even hungry. The passion of play took over all of your attention. Same too, if you can recall falling in love for the first time or being deeply involved in an excited work project. A big theme of my program is bio-individuality. That's why it's very hard to give anything more than an overview to you today, because with each program, every program looks different. The idea behind each program is that everyone's needs are very different. Everyone's in a different place. I have to meet everyone where they are. And therefore, what works for one person won't necessarily work for another. So while I sit with the clients, their personal information, social information, health and medical histories, their food logs, their cravings, they are all different from one another. Therefore, each program looks very different from one another. Some secondary food strategies. So secondary foods, you now know, are all of the actual foods that we put into our body. We analyze the food logs that come to me before sessions. We talk a lot about what exactly is going on there. We look at water intake, snacks, how we feel after eating our foods. The method that I use is called the crowding out system. I don't have time to go into that in depth, but in short, we are limiting the unhealthy foods and we are adding in nutritious and delicious foods until we're at the point where we have a well-balanced diet. We talk a lot about making a rainbow on your plate. It's a beautiful visual. It's a visual that has helped many. Oftentimes, if we go into schools today, unfortunately, we see more of the beige diet. We see the pasta, the chicken nuggets, the fries. We see most of the color on the children's plates being beige. What we're trying to do with integrative nutrition is we're trying to get our children's plates, our future generations' plates, to represent that of a rainbow. When we see the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, we know that we're getting the phytonutrients, the antioxidants in us, everything that we need to optimize our brain health. Lastly, when I provide recommendations, it's 1 to 2, tops 3 recommendations in a session. And we've seen that slow and steady wins the race. It ensures success being able to do 1 to 2, tops 3 nutritional recommendations in a session. And we are always addressing primary foods and secondary foods in the sessions. So back to the basics. My clients come out of our sessions knowing how to be a food detective in the supermarket. They know not to eat anything that has ingredients that they can't pronounce. We talk a lot about drinking enough water. What that means for everyone is different. We talk about making some easy meals at home and what that looks like. We've found favor in that during Corona as people were more isolated, looking for more things to do in the home to fulfill them. People have really taken this on and created a lot more joy in their kitchen during the last 22 months. Reducing your stress levels. So we talk a lot about decreasing stress during your day. We talk about how stress plays into sleep. We talk about how sleep plays into appetite. So if we're not getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep, again, depending upon who you are, it's pretty hard to curb your appetite. We see an increased appetite when we're not getting the amount of hours that we need in our sleep. So we talk a lot about sleep hygiene. We talk a lot about exercise. If you're like me, the idea of putting on gym clothes and going all the way to the gym to then find yourself on a treadmill is less than appealing. We talk about a lot of non-traditional ways of exercising so that we can get moving in the way that we need for our hearts to then optimize our brain, right? So we know that doing our cardiac workouts is what helps us optimize the oxygenation to our brain and gives us better brain health. So again, you don't need to go on a treadmill to be able to get the right and proper amounts of exercise that we need to optimize our health. We talk a lot about exploring our cravings, listening and understanding our cravings. This way we are then able to curb our cravings and we talk a lot about mindful eating and mindful living. So what I found to be the number one key success to my coaching is the very close and trusting relationships that form between me and my clients. Any coach that you go to, you should find yourself one that you can trust and that you can build a very close relationship with. That is absolutely necessary for your success. You want a coach that's going to always work together in every session with primary and secondary foods. You want someone that's going to hold you accountable. So you really want to have someone that you're able to check in with multiple times during the week or whenever you need help, whenever you hit a challenge or an obstacle. Coaches need to celebrate the successes of their clients. That is one of the most motivating things we can do. And of course, be there to work through the challenging days and the challenging moments. We should all be there as much as we can for our clients. I am able to be available to my health coaching clients 24 hours a day, 6 days a week over email for support. So CCBH's health coaching mission. Your health coach at CCBH will provide you with the personal and professional support that you need to transform your health and to start to live your absolute best life. Through this ripple effect, I believe that this approach will lead us all to a much brighter, healthier, and happier future for us and for future generations to come. So these minions look a lot happier. They want to thank you for spending the time with me today. I wish you all a day filled with tremendous health, joy, and great satisfaction. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Dr. Galvin. Thank you, Dr. Kleiman. Thank you, Carrie Greenfield. Thank you for giving us ideas and concepts to think about, some useful and practical lifestyle changes that we can all make. As you can see, we're all excited about opening our center in Boca Raton. Right now, before we get into the live question and answer session, I want to lead you all in a little stretch, give you a chance to step away from the computer if you need to. Before I do that, I want to try and share my QR code that I mentioned last time that we spoke in the beginning of this webinar. This is the QR code. You're going to take out your phones, open up the camera app and go ahead and scan that code. And what it will do is bring you to a survey about participation in research. It's another way for us to connect with you. Somebody from our center will be reaching out to you once you complete that survey. Just so you know, I'm going to post it one more time at the end of this webinar as well. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing that. Hopefully you've had a chance to take out your phones and scan it. And what I want to do next is just do a quick little stretch. If you've stepped away, that's fine. If you want to participate with the stretch, you can. It's going to be brief because we really want to get to the live question and answers. So the first thing we're going to do is shoulder rolls. Since we've all been looking at our screens, we'll do about 5 of them. So you're going to take your shoulders, you're going to lift them up towards your ears, roll them all the way back and down to the ground again. Let's do that again. All the way up, all the way back, all the way down. Let's do another. All the way up, all the way back, all the way down. 2 more to go. All the way up, all the way back and down. 1 more. Up, back, and down. All right, so now let's give the rib cage, let's give our spine a little stretch. You're going to bring your arms up and overhead as high as you can get them to go. Get those fingertips to touch. And you're going to reach those fingertips up toward the ceiling. This is a yoga style stretch. We're just breathing into it. And then you can bring your arms back down again, nice and slow. Great job. Now we're going to take one arm, doesn't matter which arm, you're going to bring it overhead and you're going to tilt your body. You can see what I'm doing. I'm tilting my body this way and holding. Yep. Great job, everybody. And we're bringing that back down again. And we're going to tilt to the other side, opposite arm. Stretch that rib cage, breathe into it, and you can bring your arm back down again. Okay, so now that we've done our stretch, it's time for us to start addressing some questions that the members of the community have submitted to us. First, we have somebody who is willing to be on camera with us and be switched over to a panelist. His name is Mark Masloff, and he is going to ask actually a two-parter, it looks like, question that he's submitted with us. So we're gonna let him switch over from an attendee to a panelist. And there he is. I see you, Mark. Good to have you here. Thank you for doing this.
No problem.
Great. So go ahead, you can ask us your very first question.
I wanted to know if there is any research evidence that young people in their 20s and 30s who follow the appropriate dietary recommendations, exercise regularly, remain social, refrain from tobacco use, limit alcohol use, meditate and live mindfully, will ultimately have a lower risk of developing dementia in adulthood.
Dr. Masloff, that's a great question. It's a little bit of a loaded question. So all of these things we talk about are risk factors or protective factors, but none of them are cause factors. So for example, a genetic mutation can cause disease, but a risk factor or protective factor are things that increase or decrease the likelihood of getting a disease. So the evidence would suggest that people who do these things lower their risk of getting disease in later life. But it's not perfect. And that's why I explained before, there's a really complex relationship between genes, environment, lifestyle, exposures. So there are marathon running vegan astrophysicists who develop Alzheimer's disease and Twinkie eating couch potatoes that do not. And I think one of the things that we are trying to study is to try to figure out those individual aspects that increase or decrease the risk of someone developing disease.
Thank you. My second question is, I happen to be a retired ear, nose, and throat doctor, and during my career, it was always my observation that I saw many people with hearing loss who did not respond well to hearing aids. And it almost appeared to me as if their hearing loss had some central contribution with a difficulty processing information. I wondered if there is any research that's been done in this regard, whether certain types of hearing loss possibly might even be predictive of dementia.
Another great question. So there is increasing evidence that hearing loss, particularly that begins in mid to late life, increases the risk of developing diseases like Alzheimer's disease. Again, that does not mean that someone who has hearing loss will develop disease. It just means it increases the risk. Now, there are a couple of different ways of thinking about this. In order to remember something, you have to have heard it first. And so people who have poor hearing that go undiagnosed and untreated may have memory problems because they're not hearing well. If you're not hearing well, again, you can't learn the information that you're given. And there are different types of hearing loss. So there's conductive hearing loss. And so that's sort of changes in the middle ear structure. That seems to be less linked with the risk of Alzheimer's disease. And then there's centroneural hearing loss, which is really the inner ear, which is part of the brain. And there seems to be a stronger link between that. One of our researchers here at the Comprehensive Center for Brain Health, Dr. Sarah Getz, is interested in looking at hearing. And of course, Dr. Kleiman explained a little bit about the link between speech, and hearing and speech sort of go together quite a bit. So I think this is a ripe area of research. I don't know, Dr. Kleiman, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just real brief. So the amount of information that comes into the brain, it gets reduced obviously when you have hearing loss. So the part of your brain that processes audio information is no longer getting used as much. So that loss of brain use may also contribute to cognitive impairment. If I recall, there is a study that's examining that, but it is a fairly new avenue of research. So I will keep my eye on that, and I will at some point report back.
Thank you.
Those questions, that was really great. So now we have another person that has offered to ask a question. Her name is Peggy Scarlotta. We're going to switch over to her now so she can talk about her experience and ask her question. So Mark, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Hi, Peggy, we see you.
Yes, hi. Okay, so I want to just give a brief background on, my story, my husband's story. He was diagnosed in 2012 with Parkinsonian syndrome. And this was after many years of mysterious symptoms that he was experiencing that we couldn't explain. So we embarked on a 9-year journey so far, but for 7 years of it, until we got to Dr. Galvin and the Comprehensive Brain Institute, we were chasing Parkinson's because that's kind of what we were told, no explanation. So we tried, because of me, I think I'm a fixer. I thought, we've got this, we did hyperbaric, we did acupuncture, we did stem cell treatments, we did brain diet, ketogenic diet. I mean, we were looking into clinical trials. We were spinning and just trying to fix it. And when we finally in 2019 got to the center and confirmed pretty much, my daughter kind of knew and my son and I didn't really accept, but Dr. Galvin was able to pinpoint and confirm the diagnosis that we feared. But what happened at that point, we were plugged in now to a community of people that were willing to help us and support us through the journey. So it was just a very frustrating journey up until that point. So my question is, why is it so hard to get an early diagnosis with any dementia, but to me, Lewy body in particular, because that's my experience? And is there any insight into changes that'll help the medical community and the general population to better understand and be more aware of dementias and how specialized each one is and requires much different treatment, which me as a spouse, I don't know that I depend on the medical community. And I did not find anyone who knew anything until I got to the Brain Institute.
Well, Ms. Scarlotta, thank you first for sharing your story with us. So, this is a difficult thing. In medical school, we learn about a lot of diseases. And so if we have to take a test on a disease, we can answer those test questions. But if we're not exposed to the patients with the disease or don't know we're exposed to the patients with the disease, we might not necessarily recognize it right away. And so that's one of the difficult parts of, of this. Medical training is largely hospital-based. So we're really good at seeing and diagnosing things that show up in the hospital, acute diseases, whereas the outpatient practice for diseases that never come to hospitals in general, much more difficult. And I think in particular for your husband's case with Lewy body dementia, it's the most common disease that no one's ever heard of. So it affects 1.4 million Americans, which is substantially more than a lot of other diseases that are much more well known. But people are just not very good at making the diagnosis. So one of the things that we've really tried to do at the center is to listen to people and hear their story and put their story in the context of the individual sitting in front of us.
if you've seen one patient, then you've seen one patient, and the next patient that walks through the door has a entirely different story. And while there might be common themes, I think you have to listen to the whole story to really put this all together. And that's what we've tried to do, both on our research and in our clinical practices, are to really listen to people and hear what they're telling us, and then try to put that together to provide the best diagnosis. And once we have the diagnosis, then we can work with people to develop a plan of action, right? And so there are some things that we can fix. There are some things that we can't. The things that we can't fix, can we try to reduce the burden of disease? Can we try to alleviate some of the suffering that the patient may be experiencing? Can we try to alleviate some of the worry, stress, or strain that the family member is feeling? And so that's why we have sort of our multidisciplinary approach. Carrie, did you want to add anything?
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to share with you that the Comprehensive Center for Brain Health is very dedicated to educating nursing students, nurse practitioners, medical students, social work, physical therapists. We have a robust internship program that runs throughout the year. And our hope is that we are able to create a future of medical providers that through their education with us will be able to go out into the field, and they will be able to detect early signs of cognitive impairment. Even if they themselves cannot treat or even diagnose exactly what it is, our hope is that they will be able to refer out to the community. They'll be able to refer out to neurologists and cognitive specialists so that we can detect these diseases early on. So that's what I wanted to share.
Sounds good.
That was great. Great question, Peggy. Thank you so much for doing this, and thank you for giving ourselves and the audience some insight into your own personal experience. Thank you so much for being a part of this.
Okay.
All right. So now we have another question from a community member, Frankie Wilson. We're going to switch her over so that she can ask her question to us. And it's happening. We're going to let her switch over right now.
Okay, I think I'm here.
Frankie.
Yeah, I just want to thank you all for everything you're doing. It's wonderful. It seems that every day, and perhaps more than once a day, I hear or see a commercial for Prevagen. And I'm quite skeptical that these people, they're probably actors, that they can actually tell that it's helping them. Is there any potential benefit to taking Prevagen, or is it possibly harmful?
Well, thank you, Ms. Wilson. It's a great question. A lot of people ask these questions of us. So the products that you see sold on television are supplements. By definition, a supplement is meant for healthy people. And so all supplements are required to have two statements at the bottom of the bottle. They're typically in very fine print. So whatever is said on the front of the bottle will have little asterisks next to it. Then if you turn to the back of the bottle and look all the way down at the bottom, there are two statements. First is, these statements have not been approved by the Food and Drug Administration. And the second statement is, this product is not intended to diagnose, prevent, treat, or cure disease. So if a product is not intended to diagnose, to treat, to prevent, or cure a disease, what is it actually good for? And so that's always the challenge with these things. Now, I will say that most of these products were derived from some science, right? So mostly basic science, laboratory science, looking at animal models. And so they found, that a strain of mice or a strain of rats or a strain of dogs responded better to something. And then a company decided to try to market that something. And so all the supplement has to do is not cause people to become ill, and it could be sold. So in general, the products are generally safe, although some of them have side effects because people may, be allergic to some of the ingredients. But it's unclear that they really benefit people. And so we as a group tend not to promote a lot of those sort of memory supplements. Now, there is a role for some supplements, right? So vitamins are supplements, certain macronutrients are supplements, some micronutrients are supplements. So in the right situation, under the right condition for the right person, some of these things might be quite helpful. But I think you really should talk with your medical providers, whether it's us or with your primary care doctor, to get some guidance. I don't know, Carrie, do you want to add anything to that?
I was just going to add that a lot of times I find that the results of Prevagen, for example, since we're discussing that, they're very anecdotal. So if you hear of someone that shares their story, we're trying to cling on to hope of a quick fix. And that's very human and that's very normal. So if we're living with someone that's suffering, we hear these commercials and, sadly, they're really targeted to a very vulnerable population. So if we educate people about that, I think that's one thing we can all do after today's seminar. I also, want to share that there really is no quick fix, because if there was a pill, Dr. Galvin would be prescribing it, I would be prescribing it. And many times last week in clinic, I had someone come to me with a manila folder with about 32 different article clippings of quick fixes. And I sat there with them and we went through each one by one. And you know what it came down to? It came down to me telling her, we have to work on managing your diabetes. I know it's hard. I know you don't want to do it, but this is what you can do. She wanted to take a pill because it's easier, and I get that. So the ways in which we can help our memory, optimize our brain health, is through the work that we do at the center, but not through Prevagen.
Great, thank you, Dr. Galvin and Carrie. That supplement question comes up a lot, so it's a question I'm sure that was on a lot of people's minds. Let's go on to the next audience member who has so graciously offered to ask questions. Her name is Bobby Rutt, and it looks like she's got 2 questions for us. So we're going to switch her over so that she can go ahead and ask her questions. And we do hope to answer some of the live questions that are coming in that have just been submitted from our attendees. Let's see, Bobby Rutt switches over. There we are. Hi, Bobby.
Hello.
Nice to have you here.
Great. First and foremost, I know I have a question to ask, but I just want to thank everyone that's listening to know that Dr. Galvin and his staff are just so wonderful. And they've hit the nose on the head with me every single time. So I am truly blessed. Okay. I'm not on all those medications, but that's besides the point. I would like to just tell you my question. And if anybody has any additional information, fine. Okay, my question is, how can the use of movement and speech simultaneously increase your cognitive ability?
Well, Ms. Rutt, that's a great question. So when you walk and talk, you actually activate more parts of your brain than walking alone or talking alone. So we call this dual tasking, right? So doing 2 things at the same time. And the more complex the load is, right? So if you're just chit-chatting, that's a small load. If you're, doing some mental math, that's a bigger load. If you're texting on your iPhone, that's even a bigger load. And if you do street corner neurology and you stand on the street corner, watch people walking by, the people who are just walking walk the fastest. The people who are walking and talking walk a little slower. The people who are texting walk very, very slow. So as you add the cognitive load, your speed goes down, but it shouldn't go down more than about 15%. Once you go past that, that suggests that maybe there are some changes going on in the brain. So a big part of our research is trying to understand, can we use this sort of dual tasking tool, right, to predict people at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. And then that would allow us to do an early intervention in terms of prevention. I talked about primary or secondary prevention before. So we use it as a tool, but we also use it to better understand the brain. I don't know, Amy, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, this is actually an area that I'm interested in. And in addition to what Dr. Galvin said about it being a predictor, it can also be an intervention. So in the past 3 to 5 years,
There have been some studies looking at healthy older adults and using a combination of cognitive task and a physical task. Using that over a period of time to improve cognitive scores. Whether or not there's, the retention benefits, that is yet to be seen. There does need to be more research. There have been some studies looking at Parkinson's and people who have had stroke, and there are some really good indications that it can be used as an intervention. But it does take a while for research to translate. So, I would not do it without supervision. And as far as using it as an intervention, that's something that you would have to ask your providers if it's something that they know about. So. All right, Bobby, thank you for that question. Do you have a second one?
Yes, I do. Also, when drinking wine, is it true the less alcohol content, the higher the sugar, and vice versa? The higher alcohol content, the less sugar? And how much or how little alcohol is good for me or anyone else facing mild cognitive disability? You want to put it that way? Okay.
Again, a good question. So the way alcohol is made is that the sugar becomes fermented, right? And so if you want to make a fortified wine, for example, a wine with a higher alcohol content, you add more sugar to the grapes. And so that's how fortified wine is made. So typically higher alcohol contents have higher sugar contents, both digestible and non-digestible sugars. So to answer the first part. The second part is alcohol is not necessarily great for your brain. There is something called the French paradox, where the French drink a lot of wine but have lower incidences of cardiovascular disease. But it probably isn't the wine itself. It's probably all the other aspects of drinking wine in France. So if you drink wine in France, you're typically sitting at a cafe, you're enjoying the view, you're with friends, and you're sipping that glass of wine, over the course of several hours. So it probably has less to do with the actual alcohol and probably more to do with all of the other social aspects of it. So in general, we don't want to deprive people. And so, we follow something called the Mayan Diet as our general plan. And people are allowed to have a glass of wine, a European pour, not an American pour, right? You're not drinking your wine out of a mason jar. And so on occasion, that's fine. You should enjoy life. The whole point of this is not to restrict people to enjoy your life, but, everything's good in moderation. So moderation is really the key. Carrie, did you want to add anything to that?
I wanted to clarify, Dr. Galvin just brought up a diet, the Mayan Diet, and I just wanted to interject that this is not a fad diet and it's not a trend diet. So I didn't want to confuse you with my prior talk. It's more of a lifestyle. That being said, I hope, Mrs. Rutt, that you still like us after I give my opinion about the alcohol. Before I give you my quick opinion, I want to say that the nice music in the intro that Amy played and Michael's bow tie, you should know that the first thing I said to Michael was, the only thing I'm missing in this webinar is a glass of wine. But then he told me it was too early and we were at work. So anyway, what my answer to you, Mrs. Rutt, is that at the Comprehensive Center for Brain Health, when I wear my clinic hat, I do not recommend starting to drink alcohol to prevent disease. right? So that can be confusing when we see that red wine can help with our, help combat heart disease, cancers, and diseases like Alzheimer's. Alcohol can be addictive, and many of the people out listening have addictive genes. And so for those people, I would say absolutely stay away from alcohol. It can also worsen other health problems that we've been diagnosed with. In clinic, if someone is diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, we're on the fence and there's some wiggle room in terms of how much we can allow. But if someone comes to me and Dr. Galvin or myself has diagnosed them with moderate to severe dementia, I do everything to encourage those patients to not have any alcohol whatsoever. I just want to lastly mention, when I wear my hat as health coach, when a client comes to me and they're having 4 to 6 glasses of wine a week, it's not realistic for me to tell them to stop drinking. What I will do is I will focus on limiting their alcohol content. I will discuss decreasing their frequency throughout the week. We will talk about things, just as one example to leave you with, either diluting their drink or switching over to a non-alcoholic beverage. And believe it or not, the non-alcoholic beverage portion, people don't mind it, and they come back many times thanking me that that worked for them. But in short, to conclude the answer, no amount of alcohol is good for our brain function.
Thank you, Bobby, for those questions. And thanks again for being part of this. I'd like to address some of the questions that came in through the chat. And so it looks like, let's see what we have. Is there a correlation between low testosterone and Alzheimer's? It looks like we have answered that question, but if you guys would like to, if the speakers would like to kind of talk about that a little bit more, we can do that.
Sure. So I typed an answer for everybody so they can see the answer, but so low testosterone is something called andropause, which is the male equivalent of menopause. And we understand more and more about andropause. So men that experience low testosterone can report lower energy, lower mood, trouble sleeping, irritability, and may also have some memory problems. If someone has low testosterone, they should discuss about possibly doing replacement with their primary care provider. The one concern is that if you have prostate disease, testosterone replacement could affect the size of your prostate. So you'd want to make sure you speak with your primary care providers about whether this is an option. But there are over 300 papers published that show some link either through animal models or through human studies that low testosterone may increase the risk of disease. But remember, a risk does not equal cause. A risk just puts someone at a higher than average chance of developing something. So it is important, again, to always speak with your primary care provider about whether replacement would be right for you.
We are approaching the end. We're a few minutes over. I have one other question I want to address. Somebody sent in, if someone is diagnosed at the center with mild cognitive changes, does this cause depression?
So very interesting relationship. Depression can cause memory problems in and of itself. Depression in late life is a risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's disease and the other diseases can cause depression. So it's a three-way relationship, right? So memory problems by themselves can cause depression. Depression by itself can cause memory problems, and they are related to each other in terms of increasing risk. So it's really important that if you have some depression, you speak with your primary care provider, because depression is very treatable, both with psychotherapy and with medications. And if you're experiencing some low mood and you have some memory problems, medications can help.
Great. So Thank you for that. Thank you for, the knowledge and the insights from all of the speakers today, Dr. Galvin, Dr. Kleiman, Carrie Greenfield. Just in case your questions didn't get answered today, just want to let you know that we will be compiling the answers and we can send out via email the list of questions and answers that didn't get addressed today. So don't worry, if there were some questions that came in and we couldn't address them, they will be.